Good evening. What an absolute pleasure to welcome a live, albeit masked, audience to our Rothenberg annual Ridge Lecture. This year, it's in conjunction with our James Joyce conference, Joycean Cartographies, Navigating a New Century of Ulysses. And it's a pleasure to welcome our virtual audience, because we have one, tuning in from near and far. So I think you know that 100 years ago, today, February 2nd, 1922, James Joyce celebrated the publication of his novel Ulysses on his 40th birthday. Sylvia Beach, the proprietor of the Shakespeare and Company bookstore in Paris, and Joyce's friend, his true believer, the only one brave enough to publish the novel, personally hand-delivered to him 2 copies of Ulysses in its now famous cover of blue and white, the colors of the Greek flag. The cover itself, with those colors and the one-word title, Ulysses, was just one of a myriad of clues that Joyce provided to readers to navigate the novel. Providing an actual map of Dublin to accompany his Dublin novel was not one of those clues, as Carla Nielsen, curator of our library exhibition, Mapping Fiction, has persuasively shown. Nevertheless, in presenting Dublin to the world, Joyce was determined to spread verbal and visual breadcrumbs of many, many kinds. He told his friend, the painter Frank Budgeon, "I want to give a picture of Dublin so complete that if the city one day suddenly disappeared from the earth, it could be reconstructed out of my book." You will hear that quotation if you attend the Joyce conference in the next 2 days. I'm sure you'll hear that again. And in 732 pages in the Shakespeare and Company first edition, Joyce proceeded to do that, documenting one day in the life of his main characters, at least 2 of whom moved throughout Dublin. Along the way, we learn what it feels like to navigate the city, to live, breathe, and remember in it. To steal a line from the Aeolus chapter of the book, we feel what it's like to be in the heart of the Hibernian metropolis. So throughout the next 2 days, and in Ato Quayson's Ridge Lecture tonight, we'll learn how Joyce and writers he inspired create verbal maps of real cities and what it's like to inhabit them. I am really delighted that the Huntington is the place to both host and display such guided tours through novels and cities. As many of our Huntington audience know, the Ridge Lecture is a part of our research program at the Huntington, led by Steve Hindle, the W.M. Keck Foundation Director of Research. This year, the research division enabled the Ridge Lecture to be both an introduction to the Joyce Conference and a bridge to our literary exhibition, Mapping Fiction. So I want to thank Steve and his team for their real support. This event represents a very productive collaboration among research, the library, and the President's office. So now I'd like to ask Steve to welcome you as well. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Karen. Hello, good evening, and welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many of you here in person and to recognize the participation of those who are participating remotely. As Karen said, This evening's talk is the Ridge Lecture in Literature. It was funded by an endowment in 1992 with generous contributions from Nancy and Charlie Munger at the time of Martin Ridge's retirement as Director of Research at the Huntington. Although Martin was by training a historian of the American West, he insisted that the fund be used to support public lectures in literature and literary criticism. Recent lecturers have included Professor Jim Chandler, who is here in the audience this evening, James Shapiro, Professor Sir Jonathan Bate, the writer Paul Theroux, Professor Namwali Serpell, and Dame Hilary Mantel. So there is Professor Quayson, if you're listening in the background there, no pressure. As Martin's successor but one as Director of Research, I'm pleased to be the person who introduces the person who will give the lecture in Martin's honour. Laura O'Connor is Associate Professor in the School of Humanities at UC Irvine, where she teaches 20th century poetry and Irish literature. She holds a PhD from Columbia and is the author of Haunted English, The Celtic Fringe, the British Empire and De-Anglicisation, which appeared in 2006, and of numerous essays on, amongst others, Seamus Heaney, W.B. Yeats and Paul Muldoon. To introduce this year's Ridge Lecturer, please welcome Professor Laura O'Connor.
Good evening and welcome. Trónamach Díobh agus fáilte Creole live Galéir. I am thrilled and honoured to introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Ato Quayson, at the Huntington Library's celebration of the publication of Ulysses on Joyce's 40th birthday 100 years ago. Professor Quayson is an internationally renowned literary scholar, post-colonial theorist, and interdisciplinary cultural critic. After receiving a first-class honours degree in English and Arabic at the University of Ghana, he earned a doctorate in Nigerian literature at the University of Cambridge. By his own account, it was when he moved to Cambridge that he became Black. The fact that he later became the first Black person to be tenured in the university's 800-year history attests to the complexities of his position at Cambridge. I first got to know Professor Quayson's scholarship when he taught at the University of Toronto, where he was the founding director of its renowned Centre for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. In 2019, he moved west to California. He currently holds the Jean G. and Maurice M. Doyle Professorship in Interdisciplinary Studies and English at Stanford University. Professor Quayson has published 6 monographs on topics including disability studies, African literature, Shakespeare, and post-colonial pedagogies. His most recent book, Tragedy and Post-Colonial Literature, was awarded the 2021 Robert Penn Warren Clint Brooks Award for Literary Criticism. He has edited 8 collections, including the 2-volume Cambridge History of Post-Colonial Literature. What strikes me most about Professor Quayson's work is his synthesizing intellect, ethical clarity, vast range of reference, and open-minded curiosity. To read his scholarship is to encounter what Buddhists call a beginner's mind. His willingness to approach a subject from an untested vantage and his eagerness to learn is palpable. This can all be savoured, by the way, by watching the wonderful YouTube lecture series, Critic, Reading, Writing, Professor Quayson began during the pandemic. While reading Professor Quayson's award-winning book, Oxford Street, Accra, City Life and the Itineraries of Transnationalism recently, I drew great pleasure from imagining a palimpsestic Dublin 1904 in its byways. When reading Ulysses, I'm hyper-aware to reference of fictional mappings and mapping fiction to reference the marvellous exhibition I'm eager to revisit tomorrow, because Dublin is my native city. I simply can't wait to see how Professor Quayson's beginner's mind reads Ulysses from the comparative perspective of his compendious anatomy of his native city. Let us begin. Ladies and gentlemen, I present Professor Ato Quayson. Thank you.
Let me start off first with what amounts to a really embarrassing confession. It took me something like 20 years to finally complete reading Joyce's Ulysses. This was not for lack of trying. Even though I had been introduced to a portrait of the artist as a young man at university in Ghana and quite enjoyed it, Ulysses presented a different set of challenges. I had almost given up hope of ever reading it in full until, that is, I completed Oxford Street, Accra. In my book, Oxford Street, Accra, I retold the history of the city from the time of its settlement as a small fishing village in the 1600s, through its evolution as a harbour city under British colonial rule from the late 1870s, and into its growth into the multifaceted metropolitan capital of today's Ghana. All this was done from the perspective of a single street, the Oxford Street of the title. The street served as an urban key, the turning of which took me into different aspects of the city. Turned in one direction, I entered the realm of colonial town planning and indigenous placemaking. In another direction, the special characteristics of Accra's street life, with all its buzz in creative chaos. In a third, the dynamics of youth culture to be found in the salsa scene and in that of gyms and bodybuilding. And in yet another, the domain of urban slogans and transcripts on the ubiquitous trotros, the passenger vehicles much beloved of city dwellers. The tale I told in Oxford Street required a partial focus on the mixed structural features of the city, at once highly cosmopolitan and drawing from other rapidly globalized cities in the global south, and yet also pockmarked by persistent signs of underdevelopment, much like Joyce's semi-colonial Dublin, as I discovered later. Once I finished working on Oxford Street, a fundamental change in perspective took place in my mind that I could not have anticipated beforehand. In writing the book, I had taken seriously the precept that space is not a container, but a symptom and producer of social relations. This precept has been repeated by spatial theorists as varied as Henri Lefebvre, Michel Foucault, Edward Sawyer, David Harvey, Doreen Massey, and the various others that I was influenced by in working on the book. Though the precept sounds extremely simple and straightforward, actualizing it methodologically proves extraordinarily complicated. One way of thinking about urban space as a symptom and producer of social relations is simply to focus on various aspects of urban infrastructure and how it enables or impedes the experience of space and the social dynamics that occur in, around, and through it. This infrastructural focus may also be incorporative of ideological struggles over space, such as we see in the United States today regarding debates about monuments to slave owners and Confederate soldiers, now considered to be deeply offensive to some people in the present. And as we also know from the tragic events that occurred in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017, space is also the subject of major attempts by white supremacists to expunge it of all those that they consider to not belong in the body politic, which would include racialized minorities, Jews and Muslims, all foreigners, trans people, and even, in certain instances, women. The attempt at expunging physical space of all difference has a long history not only in the United States, but in many other parts of the world, including Germany, China, and South Africa, all of which have had long histories of supremacist ideas that impact upon the infrastructures of space and thus on the permissible social relations, both in public and sometimes also in private. One of my impulses in writing Oxford Street was to find space for everything, namely, to examine principles such as ethnicity and globalization strictly in terms of what implications they raise for the experience of space. This methodological impulse had immediate implications for my thinking after the book. For one of the immediate consequences of Oxford Street is that following it, I came to understand cities completely differently. Accra helped me to experience New York and London and Singapore and Hong Kong and Boston and Venice and Toronto and the many cities that I have either lived in or visited in different and sometimes quite dramatic ways. But it was in coming back to read literature after Oxford Street that the real implications for me as a literary critic became most evident. In returning fully to teaching and writing about literature, the main consequence was a fresh sensitivity to spatial details and how to describe them. When we shift our spatial analysis to the literary sphere, there are a number of elements we're obliged to take into account. First is that within literary writing, space must be understood as a product not only of our concept of space that we might have brought from outside the text, but as a product of the discursive relations inside of the text itself. Thus, it is not enough to identify a space represented within the text as an isolate. A street on its own only partially means anything. It takes further significance, but only in relation to other represented spaces, as well as in the rhetorical orchestration by which each of the spaces is activated within the text. If Lefebvre and the others I invoked earlier have taught us that space is both the product of and the producer of social relations, then another lesson we have to bear in mind as literary critics is that literary space is first and last a product of writing. There are now three key spatial concepts I generally apply to anything I read. These are spatial traversal, means of locomotion, and chronotopes. For purposes of my talk on Joyce's novel today, however, I will be focusing primarily on the first two and will leave the third for possible discussion during the Q&A if people are interested. To start with, spatial traversal in general implies several interrelated conceptual elements. First is the very banal fact that one's relationship to space is quite different when walking or riding a horse or a bicycle or on a train. Each means of locomotion linked to spatial traversal imposes a different relationship to the spatial environment one travels through. For example, a bicycle rider in a big city such as, say, Accra, London, or Toronto requires a highly developed ambient sense of other vehicles on the road, of pedestrian density, and of the infrastructural dispositions of road signs, red lights, crossroads, and other features of cycling in the city. The person walking or in a car requires a different kind of ambient sense of space and its details. And the driver of the car has a more dynamic relationship to the road and to other road users than a passenger that is simply being driven around in the same vehicle. What is more important in the representation of spatial traversal and the means of locomotion in literature and in film, however, is the degree to which the protagonist either A, demonstrates or does not demonstrate awareness of what is going on around them in space. B, interacts with the social environment in the process of spatial traversal. And C, is open to stimuli from the external environment to trigger emotional processes, thoughts, and responses inside of their own minds. Even though these three are not mutually exclusive, it is not uncommon for them to be represented in literature and film somewhat separately. The zero sum of the representation of spatial traversal is where none of the aforementioned features is evident, and the objective is merely to show that the character has been transported from point A to point B. In this case, both the means of locomotion and the spatial traversal are simply used as the convenient conduits for changing the location of the narrative. As an example, if a character boards the train, say, in San Francisco and disembarks in Los Angeles with no description of any element of the journey or the observations of the character and of their surroundings, or of any thoughts they might have in response to these, we are looking at a zero-sum spatial traversal. The main purpose here is simply to switch the location of the narrative events. We shall not be paying much attention to the zero-sum vector of spatial traversal, at least not with respect to Ulysses, except to bear it in mind as a contrast to the other types of representation we will be looking at. Important to our discussion of Ulysses is how the specific form of locomotion in the novel, which is namely walking, and of the spatial traversal that this entails, are also represented through specific literary devices that raise implications for how we might see them in their correlation to other expressive dimensions of the novel. And so I finally came to complete my reading of Ulysses. And this time, I saw things in the novel that could not have been anticipated before I completed my own book. I'll be focusing primarily on Leopold Bloom and his perambulations and thoughts as he traverses Dublin. Especially important in my account is how the novel furnishes us with examples of what I want to describe as the relationship between spatial traversal and the infinitesimal declensions of Leopold Bloom's mind, all of which collectively help us to grasp the specific contours of Dublin and their correlation to the palimpsestic and hyperreferential character of Bloom's consciousness. I'm using the word declension here not to refer to the grammatical variation of parts of speech, such as nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and so on, but rather to the manner by which external stimuli trigger in Bloom's mind a restless oscillation between anticipation, speculation, deliberation, and desire. These always emerge in forms of the conjugation and reconjugation of elements in his memory, and also in his sensorial and linguistic purview of the urban spaces he traverses. The infinitesimal declensions of Bloom's mind reveal a number of features, which for heuristic purposes and ease of reference, I want to list as follows. 1. Bloom's wanderings in Dublin are structured around a series of large and small anticipations. Some of these anticipations, such as those about attending Dignam's funeral, and also regarding what time he might arrive home in order to avoid encountering his wife's lover, Blazes Boylan, are designed to provide temporal framings for his wanderings. At the same time, these temporal framings are also aligned to smaller and more immediate anticipations that appear to be more serendipitous in their emergence, and thus are tethered to the satisfaction or avoidance of immediate needs and frustrations. The chance encounter with McCoy in Lotus Eaters, or Bloom's oft-referenced plan to canvass some advertising from Keys in Aeolus, Lestrygonians, and Sirens, as well as his sudden urge to find somewhere to eat lunch in Lestrygonians, as examples of these smaller scale anticipations that texture the larger temporal framings. Alongside the large and small anticipations and their concomitant temporalities are a variety of memories of the past. Bloom's memories are accompanied by variant speculations about a variety of subjects, ranging from religion and cannibalism to exotic locations, social and economic agendas, and Irish history and politics, among various others. Memories of the past typically emplace Bloom as an observer and or participant in the relevant memoryscape that comes to mind in such a way as to constantly bleed agency into passive observation and vice versa. However, there is also a subtle yet significant discursive contrast between anticipations, memories, and speculations in Bloom's mind. While on the whole, anticipations register a temporally forward orientation to his reveries. In these instances, he is typically either looking forward to something or plotting some form of avoidance. The memories that come to his mind are predominantly and obviously oriented toward some edition of the past. In contrast to these two, speculations on various subjects appear to be atemporal, or at least they attempt to transcend the stimuli that triggered them from his immediate spatial environment. These convey a sense of the leapfrogging of the immediate urban setting to vaunt himself into different geographical locations and questions, some political, some sociological, and a few even utopian. The speculations appear to be structured in the form of eddies and flows, and are sometimes discursively coherent. That is to say, they cluster around the same thematic principles. But at other times, they are also somewhat dissociative in terms of the range of elements that are yoked together in the course of a single speculation. The contrast between coherent and dissociative speculations is something I shall return to in a moment. We must note, however, that anticipations, memories, and speculations are not readily separable as distinct categories, but must be read as dynamic and ever-evolving aspects of the infinitesimal declensions of Bloom's mind. The second central feature of Bloom's mind still has to do with speculations in their levels of coherence and dissociativeness, or, as I shall argue shortly, different densities of specification. This point overlaps with the previous one I just made, but must be discussed separately with respect to the dialogical relationship between stimuli and speculations, as opposed to that between stimuli, anticipations, and memories. Franco Moretti, Declan Kybird, Gary Leonard, and various others have suggested that advertising provides a central, if not the central set of stimuli for the workings of Bloom's mind. Moretti puts the matter quite forcefully, arguing that there is an extraordinary complicity between social phenomena and literary form in Ulysses, such that advertising and the stream of consciousness implicate one another throughout the novel. And since Leopold Bloom is an advertising canvasser, the observation that Moretti makes about advertising is not entirely misplaced. For example, in the Ithaca episode, Bloom thinks of some one sole unique advertisement to cause passers to stop in wonder, a poster novelty with all extraneous accretions excluded, reduced to its simplest and most efficient terms, to exceeding the span of casual vision and congruous with the velocity of modern life. Thus, he amplifies Moretti's main proposition. Moretti focuses here on a socially expressive fragment, in this case, advertising, as encapsulating the totality of social relations in early 20th century Dublin. These social relations seem to him to themselves be surrogates for relations in capitalist society in general. Thus, the fragmentariness of the stream of consciousness method is produced from the direct realization of the necessity for a new representational idiom within literature that itself mimes the social reality. Moretti's move is a standard procedure in Marxist criticism, and yet is somewhat defective. First, because it does not take account of the fact that while centering on capitalism, Ulysses is also expressly about semi-colonial and even uneven development in Dublin and elsewhere. Secondly, Bloom's many speculations and reflections are typically triggered by much more than just advertising. In fact, I rather suspect that if we were to tally up the pathways of the different triggering stimuli that touch on his mind, we would find that advertising provides quite a small percentage of such triggers. As an aside, I think this would make a very productive task for the digital humanities. I reference Moretti at length here because he captures something essential to what I'm going to say later about the relationship between writing and social transcripts in urban Accra. It seems to me, however, that the reflections instigated by advertising in Bloom's mind must be seen as the subset of procedures for generating what I want to describe as different densities of specification. The densities of specification define a continuum from coherent to dissociative. Thus, in the Hades episode, there's a certain density of specification stimulated by the graveyard at Dignam's burial. While standing in the graveyard, Bloom thinks, among other things, about the presence of bad gas in coffins, the funerary preparations of corpses, the question of what happens to body parts at the resurrection, of what might be the relative attractions of corpse manure, and the possibility that some people might be buried who were still alive. On this last point, he opines they ought to have some law to pierce the heart and make sure, or an electric clock or a telephone in the coffin and some kind of a canvas air hole, flag of distress, 3 days, rather long to keep them in the summer, just as well to get shut of them as soon as you are sure there's a no. Despite a certain degree of dispersal in these reflections, it is still possible to see them all as unfolding under the general rubric of death and the cognate fields of funerary practice and beliefs in the afterlife. In the Calypso episode, the image of the model farm run by the Palestinian Land Development Company that Bloom reads of in the newspaper he picks up at the butcher's sends his mind by slow degrees from the image of cattle in a bucolic setting to the packing of olives and then to citron. In the course of this reverie, and as he walks along the street, a new environmental factor in the form of a cloud that momentarily covers the sun inserts itself into his perceptual field and thus acts as a new triggering stimulus to his thoughts. His thoughts now darken to the Jewish imagery of barren land, bare waste, and of the oldest people wandered far away over all the earth, captivity to captivity, multiplying, dying, being born everywhere. While the two quite different external stimuli of the image in the newspaper and the cloud covering the sun are responsible for instigating the different forms of reverie in his mind, his thoughts still coalesce around a generally unified discursive field tied to an exotic geographical context, that is to say, Jewish Palestine. However, it is not always that drifts into speculations of a geographical kind are coherently shaped as in these two instances. For example, in Lotus Eaters, while on Westland Row, he halts before the window of the Belfast and Oriental Tea Company, and after reading the legends of the lead-papered packets, choice blend, finest quality family tea, his mind drifts, among other things, to Ceylon brands, the Far East, lovely spot it must be, the garden of the world, big lazy leaves to float about on, cactuses, flowery meads, snaky lianas they call them. Wonder, is it like that? His mind then moves on to speculate on what must be the lazy and languid life of the Sinhalese. And then, by way of an image he suddenly recalls, his mind goes to the manner by which a person floats on the Dead Sea, and from there to a geography lesson in high school on the principles of gravity. Except for the general rubric of exotic climates triggered by the word Oriental in the name of the tea company, it is not clear why his mind ties Ceylon, today Sri Lanka, and China to the Red Sea, even though the Red Sea has already featured earlier in his mind in the metonymic displacements triggered by the image of the Palestinian Land Development Company in the Calypso episode. Apart from the confused exoticism for bringing heterogeneous geographical places together, what is most striking in this set of speculations about the Far East is that, unlike the reflections on death at Digman's funeral, the items brought together have only the vaguest categorical affinities. The Oriental trigger produces a partly coherent but otherwise dissociative density of specification and is quite different from either speculations on the graveyard or the one triggered by the images of the Palestinian Land Development Company. In the speculations about the Palestinian Land Development Company that are triggered by the image in the newspaper, where even the interposition of the secondary external stimulus of the cloud momentarily covering the sun does not make him veer off the general thread of the speculations, but only darkens it to include the historicity of Jewish suffering. The contrast between thematic coherence and dissociativeness in Blue's mind that are triggered by various external stimuli also mean that his interactions with Dublin as he traverses it serve to texturize space differently. Furthermore, Dublin offers the opportunity for both geographical expansion in his mind, from Ceylon to China to the Dead Sea and Palestine, but also even more importantly, to different modes of colonial relations. Given that Ireland at this time is itself in a semi-colonial relation to Britain, the incorporation of other colonial reference in Bloom's mind as he traverses Dublin means that he is also invoking templates of a comparative colonialism that are manifest in the unevenness of development that unfolds itself before him as he walks around the city. We must note, however, that what I have just described as speculations are different to the memory traces that also appear in Bloom's mind, where the objective seems to be that of emplacing him in different spatial locations, either as a perceiver of an action or as a means by which he might produce retrospective justifications for his own choices in the remembered scenarios. The third feature of infinitesimal declensions I want to highlight is a little bit more elusive and thus requires us to reach momentarily beyond Ulysses for its elaboration. While, as I have noted thus far, there is ample evidence of anticipation, speculation, and memory in Bloom's mind, there is also the frequent eruption of desire and affect into his reveries. The eruption of affect performs a peculiar work within narrative in general that can be illustrated beyond James Joyce. For within narrative, the eruption of affect tends to bind emotion to thought and image in such a way as to render the three inseparable within the domain of the inner monologue or stream of consciousness. This binding generates what I describe in an essay I wrote comparing the Jewish writer Sholem Aleichem to the Nigerian Chinua Achebe as the thought-affect-image nexus that is sometimes only fragmentary and at other times manifests itself as the intensification of the perspectival sensorium. In terms of European modernist writers, the nexus is elaborately worked out in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, especially in the mind of Septimus Warren Smith. An even more concentrated example can be found in Samuel Beckett's Murphy. I'm thinking here specifically of the scene where Murphy interrupts his duty rounds at the modeling mental mercy seat to play a game of chess with the imperturbable Mr. Endon, who is ready and waiting for him in his cell. And this is what we see. Mr. Endon, an impeccable and brilliant figurine in his scarlet gown, his crest a gush of vivid white against the black shag, squatted tailor fashion on the head of his bed, holding his left foot in his right hand and in his left hand his right foot. The purple pulaines were on his feet and the rings were on the fingers. The light spurted off Mr. Endon north, south, east, west, and in 56 other directions. The sheet stretched away before him, as smooth and taut as a grounding wife's belly, and on it a game of chess was set up. The little blue and olive face, wearing an expression of winsome fiat, was upturned to the Judas. The color scheme of the scene, vivid white against black shag, purple pulaines, and the light spurting off in 56 different directions, helped to seal the image as an aspect of perspectival intensification for Murphy. This scene is subsequently followed by a relay of other images that get inextricably tied to states of thought and feeling in Murphy's mind that lead by slow degrees to his eventual accidental suicide. The scene in Mr. Ennon's cell offers a very good illustration of the thought-image-affect nexus I'm striving to elaborate. With respect to Bloom's mind, the image-affect-thought nexus is also repeatedly on display, but perhaps most strongly in his reactions to what he encounters on entering Burton's restaurant in the Lestrygonians episode. Smells of men. His gorge rose, spat on sawdust, sweetish, warmish cigarette smoke, reek of plug, spilt beer, men's beery piss, the stain of ferment, couldn't eat a morsel here. The entire scene is filled with appeals to all the senses, such as that of smell, of the presumably sweaty working men, sweetish cigarette smoke, spilt beer, piss, and so on. But it is also clearly visually affecting, with a sense of the diversity of elements registering an almost visceral reaction in him. His gorge rose, and he decided that this was no place to eat. His encounter with the scene is marked by disgust and nausea. Nausea, and indeed also vertigo, is often the sign of an existential disorientation before a representational vortex. The scene in Burton's bar has also been interpreted by various scholars as being one of the moments when Bloom is confronted by forms of masculinity that he either disavows or at least is seriously uncomfortable with. Am I like that? He asks himself. But for me, it is a clear illustration of the image-affect-thought nexus that we find variously displayed in the novel. While each of these infinitesimal declensions to Bloom's mind help us to get a sense of the texturization of space as he traverses Dublin, and indeed we would be well rewarded by remaining inside the city with him, as many readers of Ulysses have profitably done. I want to go back to what I pointed out earlier regarding the impact of Oxford Street on my reading of the novel. It turns out that the traffic was not one way after all. For if my book helped me finally to complete Ulysses, Joyce's novel also assisted me not only in re-engaging with the urban form of Accra, but also with understanding the relationship between various expressive fragments and the many aspects of the city. One of the things that I hope has become evident so far in my discussion of Bloom's mind is the peculiar relationship that is established in the novel between manifest details of the urban environment and different forms of latency that emerge through the workings of his mind. This relationship between manifest and latent may be taken as a direct analog of the palimpsestic nature of cities. That is to say, that cities are typically layered in terms of infrastructure or other urban features that do not obliterate or efface previous manifestations that also lie at both surface and depth. The relationship of the manifest and the latent, or in another register, of palimpsest and trace, is one of an active dynamism rather than of inertia. But to arrive at the dynamism requires an excavation of the oftentimes concealed semiotic systems that shadow or otherwise proliferate meanings alongside or right behind the surface of the urban form. While I will not have enough time in the period remaining to unpack this particular point properly, I want to quickly point to an important feature of the urban scripts of Accra's landscape that I have long been fascinated by, and that, subsequent to my reading of Ulysses, took on a different salience. I am referring here to the trotro or passenger lorry slogan inscriptions, of which I wrote about in Oxford Street, and that I find myself constantly returning to. Viewed in one way, the slogans you have just seen are merely the expressive fragments of a local social imaginary that speak to political sentiments, cultural values, and even gender conflicts. But revisiting these structural inscriptions after Ulysses, I realized that they also divulge the terms of a productive struggle between different linguistic registers and languages within Accra's multilingual context. What I'm calling a struggle might also be seen as a kind of relay between languages, in which the passage or transition between languages is deliberately short-circuited upon the surface of the slogan, as though to momentarily suspend the translational activity that subtends the surface of the text. But reading Ulysses and tracking the infinitesimal declensions of Bloom's mind, and in fact the other characters as well, taught me that perhaps what would require was the active deployment of these expressive fragments and urban details as a trigger not just for private speculations or memories, but for the excavation of the palimpsestic nature of the details. Once I applied this principle, it turns out that the trotros are pointing to different processes and relationships between orality and writing, and between English and the various local languages against which it brushes constantly. But this particular mode of perception also meant reinterpreting a whole domain of colonial and post-colonial history from the perspective of the seemingly banal, expressive fragments of the Trotro slogans. There are many writers, both Euro-American and others, that have been inspired by Joyce to produce a cartography of their own cities. A completely random and inexhaustive list would have to count the likes of the Ghanaian Kofi Awuno's This Earth My Brother, the Chilean Roberto Bolaño's 2666, the Jamaican Marlon James's A Brief History of Seven Killings, and America's own Toni Morrison's Jazz, among many, many others we might think of. But the point I am trying to make is a bit more complicated than the reference to a book list might avow. What I'm suggesting that perhaps it is time to take Joyce's cartographical sensibility in Ulysses as a highly generative offering because of the degree to which he orchestrates the means by which we might see cities as sediments of many things, both material and discursive, that are tied to urban space, but also meaningful as they impact on the consciousness of those that interact with the urban. It turns out that every city needs its Joyce. Not Joyce the Dubliner, but Joyce the superbly meticulous, but also subtly intuitive urbanist. Thank you very much.